I need to read the transcript file to understand the original story structure before writing the new one. Now I have the full transcript. Let me write the new story. I have to leave my home in 30 days. That's what the notice said, except it wasn't a legal notice, not written on any official paper. It came from my own daughter's mouth, standing in the hallway of the house I had owned for 38 years, arms crossed, voice flat, like she was canceling a subscription she'd grown tired of. "Mom," Audrey said, "this arrangement isn't working anymore. Patrick and I need room to grow. You'd honestly be happier somewhere more suited to your stage of life." My stage of life. I was 67 years old. I had buried my husband, raised my daughter alone through her teenage years after Malcolm got sick, and kept this house standing through 2 recessions, a leaky roof, and the kind of loneliness that creeps into every corner after someone you loved for 34 years simply stops breathing beside you one January morning. And now my daughter was telling me, in the kitchen where she learned to make her first omelet, that I belonged somewhere else. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at her for a long moment, then nodded and said, "I'll think about it." Neither of us knew what I was actually thinking. Let me tell you something about grief that nobody warns you about. It doesn't stay where you put it. When Malcolm died, the grief settled everywhere inside the house. In his coffee mug on the counter, I couldn't bring myself to move. In the way the heating systems made a particular sound every morning, that reminded me of the way he'd sigh when he finally sat down after a long day. In the chair by the back window where he used to read the weekend paper, with his reading glasses slightly crooked because he'd sat on the good pair in 2019 and refused to replace them. For a while after he passed, the grief made me feel closer to him. Then slowly, it just made me feel alone. We had lived in this house, on Lakeridge Crescent in Barrie, Ontario, since Audrey was 7 years old. Malcolm had insisted on this particular neighborhood because of the trail system nearby. He was a trail runner before his knees gave out, and, even after they did, he would walk those paths nearly every evening until the last few months when he couldn't. We'd painted that house 3 times together, argued about the color of the dining room, planted a Japanese maple in the front yard that now grew taller than the front porch. After Malcolm died, Audrey called every few days. She lived in Hamilton then with Patrick, her husband of 4 years, and the calls felt genuine, warm, even. She'd check whether I was eating, whether I'd been outside, whether I needed her to drive up for the weekend. I think I mistook that attention for the love it might have once been, before financial pressure made people into different versions of themselves. The call came on a Wednesday evening, in late February. I remember because I was watching snow fall through the kitchen window, one of those thick, soft Ontario snowfalls that turns the yard white and silent in under an hour. Audrey was crying, not politely, not softly, the way people cry when they've been holding it back for weeks and finally lose the grip on it. "Mom," she said, "we're in serious trouble." Patrick had lost his position as a regional manager with a building supply company. They had credit card debt I hadn't known about. Their landlord in Hamilton had increased rent by $400 a month. Audrey's graphic design contracts had slowed to almost nothing during the winter. "We just need a few months," she said, "until we can get ourselves sorted out. You have the space. And honestly, you're alone up there anyway, so." The "so" did something to me. Like my loneliness was a convenient argument for what she needed. But she was my daughter. And the house had 4 bedrooms. And Malcolm would have said yes immediately, without hesitation, probably would have already started making up the room before she finished asking. "Of course," I told her. "Come home." I meant it. I genuinely meant it. The first month was almost lovely. I'll be honest about that because it matters. Audrey brought warmth back into the house the way only family can. She cooked elaborate dinners some nights, the kind she used to try as a teenager when she went through a phase of wanting to be a chef. Patrick fixed the bathroom faucet that had dripped since autumn. He also replaced a weathered board on the back deck that Malcolm had meant to get to and never managed. I gave them the larger guest room at the end of the hall. It had the private bathroom and the better morning light, and they were young and they needed the comfort more than I did. I told myself that was generosity. Later, I understood it was practice for what they would eventually expect from me. Little things shifted. At first, so small I convinced myself I was imagining it. Audrey started buying different groceries. Nothing dramatic, just quietly replacing the things I usually kept with things she preferred. My decaffeinated coffee disappeared. The type of bread I'd eaten every morning for 20 years suddenly wasn't in the cupboard. When I mentioned it gently, she smiled and said, "Oh, I'll get it next time," and then didn't. Patrick started using Malcolm's parking spot in the driveway without asking. This sounds like nothing. I understand that. But Malcolm had a particular habit of reversing carefully into that spot so the car faced out. And for months after he died, I still looked at it each morning expecting to see his car there. When Patrick started using it, facing the wrong direction, I felt something I couldn't fully name. Something like erasure. I didn't say anything about the parking spot. That was my first mistake. Silence, I would eventually learn, has a way of being mistaken for permission. By spring, the house started to feel less like mine in ways I struggled to articulate. Audrey rearranged the living room furniture one afternoon, while I was at my Thursday volunteer shift at the food bank. She said the old arrangement blocked the natural light. I stood in the doorway when I came home and blinked at a room that looked familiar. The way a photograph of your own face looks familiar. Technically correct, but somehow strange. "Doesn't it look better?" Audrey asked, genuinely pleased with herself. I said yes because it seemed unkind to say no. The curtains in the dining room were replaced next. Audrey called them dated, which I understood to mean they reminded her of me rather than her. Malcolm had helped me choose those curtains at a shop in downtown Barrie on a Saturday afternoon, when Audrey was already in university. We'd argued pleasantly about color for 20 minutes, and then he'd pointed at the warm sage green ones and said, "Those, Fern. Those are the ones." And as usual, he was right. Those curtains went into a bag in the garage. I brought them back inside and put them in my bedroom closet. That felt like hiding something precious before someone else could discard it. Malcolm had been a woodworker in the way some men are gardeners or fishermen. It was his form of patience. The garage held his workbench, his tools organized on pegboards he'd built himself, his project wood stacked neatly against the back wall. He'd made Audrey's first bookshelf in that garage. He made a small side table I kept beside my bed. He made me a cedar jewelry box for our 25th anniversary that still held things I couldn't look at directly without crying. One Saturday afternoon in April, I went out to the garage to find a storage basics and found Patrick reorganizing. The workbench had been pushed into the corner to make room for a gym setup, a folding weight bench, a squat rack that barely fit under the ceiling, a rubber mat spread across the floor. I stood very still. Malcolm's tools were still on the pegboards, but the pegboards had been shifted to the far wall to accommodate the mirror Patrick had mounted. I figured this space wasn't really being used, Patrick said, appearing behind me with a protein shake in hand. The space was being preserved. That's what I wanted to say. Instead, I said, "Let me know if you need help finding anything." Then I went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a long time without moving. Malcolm had died in January. It was now April. 15 months. And already, the evidence of his life was being quietly compressed into corners to accommodate someone else's convenience. That night, I opened the cedar jewelry box and held it for a while in the dark of my bedroom. Patrick's weights were not the problem. I need to be clear about that. People need space, especially people under financial stress. The problem was the way it happened. The assumption, the complete absence of, would it be all right if I moved some things? Malcolm used to say you can learn everything about a person's character by how they treat spaces that belong to someone else. Whether they ask first, whether they acknowledge the weight of what they're touching. Patrick never asked. Neither did Audrey, really. Not anymore. Not about the curtains, not about the furniture, not about the groceries. These seemed like small things individually. Together, they were building towards something. The mail incident happened in May. I came home from my Tuesday morning book club to find 3 envelopes on the kitchen counter, already opened. One was from my financial planner. One was from my insurance company. One was a personal letter from my old friend Constance, who had moved to Victoria after her own husband passed, and still wrote actual letters on actual paper, which I treasured. Constance's envelope had been opened and set aside, the letter inside not refolded properly. Patrick was in the kitchen eating lunch when I walked in. "My mail was opened," I said quietly. He looked up without concern. "I thought it might be something important. It's addressed to me." "Right, but we're all living here together." He said it the way people say things that seem reasonable to them without considering what they're actually saying. I stood very still. In Canada, opening someone else's mail without permission is a federal offense. He set down his fork slowly. "Fern, I wasn't reading your bank statements." But he had read Constance's letter. I could see from the way it was folded back that someone had read it and set it down mid-page. "Please don't open my mail again," I said. Patrick gave me a long, patient look. The kind of look people give elderly relatives who are being unnecessarily difficult. Then he said, "Of course," in the tone of someone agreeing to something unreasonable just to keep the peace. That night, I went to bed early and lay awake listening to them, laughing at something on television downstairs. In my own house. In the living room with the wrong furniture arrangement. In the room where the wrong curtains now hung. I started paying closer attention after that. To the things they said when they thought I wasn't fully listening. To the way they described the house when friends came over. To the language they used about the future. Audrey said, "Our renovations" in conversation. Once, then again, then regularly. Patrick talked to a friend on speakerphone one evening, while I was in the kitchen making tea. I wasn't trying to listen, but the walls in that house carried sound the way old houses do. "The thing is, this neighborhood has gone up 30% in the last 5 years," Patrick said. "If we develop the basement properly and hold it another decade, we're looking at serious equity." I stood very still with the kettle in my hand. "Her name is on the title though, yeah?" the friend asked. Patrick lowered his voice. "Not enough. For now." I put the kettle down carefully and stood at the counter for a long time. For now. The dinner party changed something in me permanently. Audrey had been planning it for 2 weeks. A group of Patrick's business contacts, a couple Audrey had met through a local design network, a woman named Heather, who was apparently connected to some development company Patrick was hoping to work with. She told me about it 3 days in advance. Not asked, told. "Patrick's having some people over Saturday," she said. "Professional contacts. Just keep it low-key, okay?" "Low-key," I repeated. "Don't bring up the sale of the Hendersons' house or anything like that. Or your health stuff. People don't love heavy conversation at dinner parties." My health stuff. I had mentioned once, that my knee was bothering me in the cold. This had apparently been catalogued as health stuff to be managed in front of company. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed for a while. On Saturday, I dressed carefully. A blue-gray blouse Malcolm had bought me in Niagara-on-the-Lake, the year before he got sick, pearl earrings, my silver hair pinned back neatly. When I came downstairs, Audrey glanced at me and said, "Oh, you're getting dressed up." "It's a dinner party," I said. She laughed briefly. "I just meant don't hover, okay? Let people breathe." The guests arrived around 7. Patrick transformed into a version of himself I hadn't seen before. Expansive, loud, charming. He offered wine poured generously and talked about his plans with the ease of a man entirely confident in his future. I sat quietly at one end of the table, mostly listening. At some point, the woman from the development company, Heather, admired the dining room. "These old Barry houses have such good bones," she said. "The right renovation would make this something special." Patrick nodded with the casual authority of someone discussing their own property. "We've been talking about what we'd do with the main floor. Open concept is really where the market is now." Audrey nodded. "And the backyard has so much potential. Malcolm planted that Japanese maple, but honestly it crowds the space." "Malcolm planted it." She said it the way you mention a previous owner. I looked at my daughter. She glanced at me briefly, then away. Heather asked me politely, "Have you lived here long?" 38 years, I said, a small silence. Then Patrick laughed. "Practically a historic landmark." Light laughter around the table. Later, Heather asked what I did with my time. Audrey answered before I could. "Mom keeps busy. she said with a smile that was meant to seem affectionate. Volunteering at the food bank, book club, lots of quiet time. I also paint, I said, watercolors, and I'm taking a course in landscape photography this spring. Audrey blinked, very slightly, as if she'd forgotten I was a person with ongoing interests. Heather nodded politely. That's lovely. Patrick refilled his own wine. We've also been doing some research into care communities nearby, he said, to no one in particular, just in terms of planning ahead. The table went strangely quiet. I looked at him. Then at Audrey. Audrey's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't contradict him. Care communities, I said carefully. Just thinking long term, Patrick said. The stairs are already a bit much, right, Fern? I was 67 years old. I walked the lake trail 3 times a week. I had climbed those stairs every day for 38 years. I managed the stairs quite well, I said. Patrick laughed. Of course you do. Nobody's rushing anything. But nobody is rushing anything is exactly what people say when they are in fact rushing something. They're just waiting for you to feel rushed without anyone having to take responsibility for the rushing. After dinner, I went to the kitchen to make coffee. I stood at the counter for a moment, listening to the laughter from the dining room. My dining room. My kitchen. The countertop Malcolm had helped me choose. The floor we'd argued about refinishing until we finally did it one long October weekend, and then stood back and agreed it had been worth the arguing. Audrey came in behind me. That went well, she said, satisfied, reaching past me for the dessert plates. You discussed putting me in care in front of your guests, I said quietly. She sighed. Already sighing before I'd finished the sentence. Patrick was just making conversation about my future. In my own home. Fern, your father's name is still on this house in my heart, I said. The word came out steadier than I felt. And your guests just discussed demolishing his maple tree and what renovations they'd make to our dining room. Audrey set down the plates carefully. Her voice shifted. Mom, we are not having this conversation tonight. Not we can't have it. Not I'm sorry. I understand why that hurt. We are not having this conversation tonight. Because it was inconvenient. Because I was being, in some unspoken way she'd been building toward for months, difficult. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. Then I said, "Good night, Audrey." And I went to bed. I lay awake for hours. At some point, I heard the last guest leave, heard the door close, heard Patrick's triumphant voice carrying down the hall, describing Heather's potential usefulness. Heard Audrey laugh at something. Heard the clink of bottles being gathered. I thought about the Japanese maple in the front yard. Malcolm had driven 3 hours to find that particular variety. He'd wanted a tree with autumn color, he said. Something dramatic. Something we'd look forward to every year. He planted it on a Saturday, while Audrey, then 12, sat on the porch doing homework and pretending not to be interested. By Sunday, she was out there asking him questions about root systems. She had forgotten that, or decided not to remember it anymore, which might be worse. The next morning, after Patrick left for a meeting, and before Audrey came downstairs, I went to the garage. I stood at the workbench in the corner for a while, ran my hand along the wood, found Malcolm's old spirit level hung on the pegboard, and held it until the small bubble inside the glass settled perfectly to center. Then I picked up my phone and called Lawrence Beaumont. Lawrence had been Malcolm's lawyer, and eventually, ours together. He was a careful, quiet man in his early 70s who had handled our wills, our property transfer after Malcolm's diagnosis, everything that mattered. He had attended the small service after Malcolm died and stayed afterward to make sure I had eaten something. He answered on the second ring. "Fern," he said, "I was wondering when you'd call." That stopped me. "You were expecting to hear from me?" A careful pause. "I hoped you would reach out." I looked at the spirit level in my hand. "Lawrence, I need to understand something about my situation." "Legally? Come see me," he said. "Tomorrow morning, if you can." Lawrence's office was on Dunlop Street, above a travel agency that had somehow survived every economic wave of the last 20 years. The elevator smelled like old carpet and something almost woodsy, and the waiting room had framed photographs of Lake Simcoe across the seasons that I had sat across from so many times they'd become familiar as wallpaper. When I walked in, Lawrence stood immediately. His expression was the particular kind of careful that means someone has been waiting to tell you something. Sit down, Fern. I sat. Tell me about the house first. The house is yours, he said, completely and solely. Malcolm was very deliberate about the structure. The transfer is clean. There is no mechanism by which Audrey or Patrick would have any legal claim, unless you choose to create one. I nodded slowly. Have they asked you to sign anything? Not yet. The yet settled between us. Lawrence opened a file folder. 3 months ago, someone contacted a mortgage brokerage associated with a development loan. They were making inquiries about refinancing options on a residential property on Lake Ridge Crescent. My chest tightened. Patrick. Lawrence nodded. He was seeking information on equity extraction based on projected future ownership. Future ownership. Like I was already gone. Like I was already past tense in my own life. He can't do anything without my signature, I said. No, Lawrence said. But he doesn't know that his inquiries are documented, and he clearly believes he's working towards something. He removed his glasses. Fern, I want to say something that may be uncomfortable. Say it. I think they have been treating your patients as consent. He set the glasses on the desk. Malcolm worried about this. Not specifically, but generally. He was very particular about how the property documents were structured. He said to me once that he trusted Audrey, but that he didn't fully trust what love can become under financial pressure. I looked at the Lake Simcoe photograph on the wall, October ice forming at the edges. There's more, Lawrence said. He reached into the drawer and produced a small envelope. My name, in Malcolm's handwriting. I know people describe the world going still in certain moments. It does. Everything in that office held its breath. He gave this to me approximately 2 years before he died, Lawrence said quietly. He told me to hold it until you truly needed it. He paused. I believe you truly need it. I couldn't open it there. My hands were shaking too visibly. I put it in my bag and held my hands together in my lap until they steadied. What are my options? I asked. You can remove them from the property legally, Lawrence said. You can also simply sell. Sell. The word landed with a weight I hadn't anticipated. If I sell, I said slowly, the property is yours to sell at any time, entirely at your discretion, without their knowledge or consent. He looked at me carefully. You are not powerless, Fern. Nobody had said that to me in a very long time. I drove home in a kind of silence I can only describe as clarity. Not peace, not yet, but the first clear sight of the horizon after a long time looking at the floor. That evening, Patrick talked on the phone in the kitchen about timeline projections on a construction financing conversation I couldn't entirely follow. Audrey showed me photos of kitchen renovation ideas on her tablet without seeming to notice the contradiction of showing me plans for my own kitchen. I smiled and said, the light fixtures looked nice. That night I opened Malcolm's letter. Fern, if you're reading this, then something has become harder than it should be. I know you. You've probably been quiet about it much longer than you should have. You were always better at patience than at protecting yourself. And I love that about you and worried about it in equal measure. I want you to remember something. This house was never about property. It was about the life we chose to build inside it together. And if the life inside it stops feeling like yours, then the house is just walls. You are not walls. I built a workbench in that garage and a bookshelf and a maple tree and 34 years of quiet ordinary love. And all of it was for you, not for a legacy. Not as something to be inherited or leveraged or improved, for you. To give you something solid while I was there, and something to stand on when I wasn't. You are allowed to let it go. You are allowed to choose differently. You are allowed, still, to have a life that feels like yours. Don't disappear, Fern. Not for anyone. All my love, still, always. Malcolm sat on the edge of the bed for a long time in the quiet of my room. Outside, an April wind moved through the Japanese maple. Then I picked up my phone and called my old friend Rosemary Aldercott, who had sold her own house 3 years ago and now lived in a condo near Kempenfelt Bay, and who had told me, once, over too much wine on her back patio, that selling was the best decision she ever made. I need a real estate agent, I said. Someone I can trust completely. Rosemary didn't ask questions. She just said, I'll call you in the morning. Rosemary connected me with a woman named Christine Lavallee, who had sold property in Barrie for 22 years, and whose calm, direct energy reminded me of no one so much as my late mother. We met at Christine's office on a Tuesday morning, while Audrey and Patrick were both out. I told her the situation. She listened without interrupting, which I had come to understand was rarer than it should be. "The market is strong right now," she said. "A property like yours on Lakeridge, with the trail access and the lot size and the location, would move quickly." "How quickly?" "Days, potentially. If you price it right and we handle it discreetly." "Discreetly?" "Yes." I asked her what the process looked like. She walked me through it carefully, professionally, without once making me feel foolish for not knowing things I'd never needed to know. She asked whether there were other occupants in the property, and I told her yes, my daughter and son-in-law, month to month. No formal lease. Christine nodded. "You'd need to provide 60 days' notice," she said, "but the sale itself can move forward without their involvement." 60 days. I thought about the equity inquiries Patrick had made to the mortgage brokerage. I thought about Heather's comments about the maple tree. I thought about Constance's opened letter sitting on the kitchen counter, improperly refolded. "Let's move forward," I said. The listing photos were taken on a Thursday, while Audrey was in Hamilton for a client meeting and Patrick was at his gym. Christine was efficient and thoughtful. She paused in the backyard for a moment, looking at the Japanese maple. "This is a beautiful tree," she said. "My husband planted it." She nodded, and something in her expression told me she understood what she was looking at. Within 4 days, we had 3 serious offers. The one I chose came from a couple named James and Nadia Cartwright. Late 30s, both teachers, moving back to Barrie to be closer to Nadia's parents. Christine told me Nadia had cried briefly during the showing, standing in the backyard. She said it felt like a home someone had loved properly, Christine told me. I accepted their offer that afternoon. I didn't tell Audrey or Patrick immediately. In the days that followed, I continued living normally. Made coffee in the mornings, kept my volunteer shifts, attended book club. I watched Audrey browse renovation ideas with a quiet interior knowledge she couldn't see. The night before I planned to tell them, Patrick came home, excited about a new development contact he'd made, someone connected to a project near the waterfront. He talked about the opportunity at dinner for 40 minutes. At one point, he gestured around the kitchen. "Once we have equity to work with," he said, "everything opens up." Audrey caught my expression briefly and looked away. That night, I wrote a letter to James and Nadia Cartwright that I left with Christine to deliver after closing. In it, I asked them to take care of the maple tree. I told them about Malcolm, and about the workbench in the garage, and about the squeaky third stair that we'd always meant to fix, and then decided we'd grown fond of. I told them I hoped the house would hold them the way it had held us. The following morning, I asked Audrey and Patrick to sit down at the kitchen table. Patrick looked at his phone first, then set it aside. Audrey seemed immediately tense in the way people become when they sense something coming. "I've made a decision about the house," I said. Patrick nodded slowly. "Okay, I've sold it." The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Audrey said, "What?" "The sale closes in 3 weeks. You'll have 60 days notice as required, which actually extends beyond the closing date. So, Mom." Audrey stood up from the table. "What are you talking about? The house is sold. I signed the papers on Tuesday." Patrick stared at me. The expression on his face moved through confusion into something I recognized as the beginning of understanding. The particular look people get when they realize their assumption has been structurally incorrect. "You can't just sell the house," Audrey said. Her voice was rising. "I can," I said. "And I have, without telling us. Without asking your permission," I said gently. "Yes." Patrick stood slowly. "This doesn't make any sense. We have things here. We've been planning." "I know what you've been planning," I said. Something in my tone stopped him. I looked at my daughter. "You told me I needed somewhere more suited to my stage of life," I said. "I found somewhere." Audrey opened her mouth and closed it again. "The buyers are wonderful," I said. "A young couple, teachers. They love the backyard. They're going to take care of the maple tree." Patrick's voice had gone strange. "Fern, this is..." He stopped. ran his hand over his face. I could see him doing calculations, rapid, desperate ones. The equity, he finally said. I'm sorry? He looked at Audrey. Something passed between them. Audrey sat back down heavily. Patrick took out a business line of credit, she said. Her voice was very quiet now. Partially based on projected equity. I stayed still. Projected equity in my home. Neither of them answered immediately. He told the lender we'd be taking ownership, Audrey said. Patrick made a sharp sound. Audrey? She should know, Audrey said, and her voice had shifted into something exhausted and honest that I hadn't heard from her in months. She should have known a long time ago. I looked at Patrick. You borrowed against a property you don't own and never had any claim to. He stood very still. How much? I asked. A long silence. Then Audrey said, 60,000. I closed my eyes briefly. Malcolm's spirit level. The bubble settling at center. Equilibrium found when everything is level and true. That's your situation to resolve, I said finally. Not cruelty. Just fact. Patrick left the room. A door closed somewhere in the house. Audrey sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing. After a long moment, she spoke. When did you know, she asked quietly. That you'd stopped seeing me as a person? She flinched. Gradually, I said. The same way it happened. Audrey stared at the table. Her voice, when it came, was almost nothing. I didn't mean for it to become this. I know. Dad would be. She stopped. Couldn't finish. I know, I said again. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, the Japanese maple was doing what it did in late spring, filling in with small bright leaves that shook in the wind off the lake. I still love you, I said. That didn't change. Audrey started crying then. Not the managed, pressured crying from months ago. Something real and broken and much younger sounding. The crying of someone who has arrived, finally, at a truth they didn't want to look at. I put my hand briefly on her shoulder as I stood up from the table. Then I went to my room to continue packing. My condo on the 7th floor of a building near Kempenfelt Bay had a balcony that faced west toward the water. I moved in on a Saturday in early June. Rosemary came and helped me arrange furniture, and we drank wine on the balcony afterward, watching the light go gold across the bay. Lawrence had called that morning to confirm the closing had completed without complication. The space was smaller than the house by a significant degree. There was no garage, no backyard, no squeaky stair. There was no workbench. But there was also no tension in the walls, no sense of needing permission to exist in my own space. No weight of accumulated disrespect pressed into every room. I put Malcolm's cedar jewelry box on the dresser. I hung 2 of his woodworking tools on the wall as art because they were beautiful, and because they were his, and because in this space I could decide what beauty meant. I brought a small cutting from the Japanese maple in a pot, a long shot at transplanting but worth trying, and put it on the balcony in a spot that got morning sun. The first morning I woke up there, I made coffee and took it to the balcony and sat looking at the water until the light shifted into full day. No one needed anything from me. The quiet was enormous and entirely mine. I thought about Malcolm, not with grief, exactly, with something that felt more like gratitude. He had known me long enough and well enough to write a letter that found me exactly when I needed it, which is perhaps the truest measure of being known by someone. Audrey called that afternoon, I answered. Are you settled? She asked. Her voice was careful, the specific careful of someone choosing words in a new landscape they don't yet know how to navigate. Getting there, I said. A pause. It was the right thing, she said. Selling. I know that. I waited. I'm not saying I handled everything well. Her voice was unsteady. I know I didn't. No, I said. Patrick and I are working through some things. Another pause. He's looking into restructuring the loan. It's a mess. But it's our mess. I'm not calling to make it yours. That surprised me. Honest surprise. I'm calling because I want you to know I'm sorry, she said. Actually sorry. Not sorry you're upset. Sorry that I did those things. I stood at the balcony looking at the bay. I know you are, I said. Can I come see the new place sometime? When I'm ready, I said. Not yet. She accepted that without argument, which itself was something new. After I hung up, I stood at the balcony railing for a long time. The water was very blue that afternoon, that particular sharp June, blue that only happens when the air is still cool and the sun is strong. I thought about the maple tree. Whether the Cartwright family had noticed it yet, whether Nadia had stood beneath it the way I used to in autumn, looking up through the turning leaves. I hoped she had. I hoped someone was standing under it right now, looking up. Rosemary came for dinner 2 weeks later, and Christine Lavalley sent a small succulent plant with a note that said, "For your new beginning." The woman from my book club, Nora, who had read the same novel 4 times because she said some books improve with returning to them, invited me to join a small watercolor group she ran on Thursday afternoons at the community center near the marina. I said yes. The painting sessions were quiet and companionable. We made bad watercolors and good conversation, and drank tea, and occasionally someone said something so sharp and true about life that the whole room went briefly silent in recognition. One afternoon, a woman named Gillian set down her brush and said, "The hardest thing about getting older isn't the body. It's learning to stop apologizing for taking up space." I thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. There's something they don't tell you about the years after 60. People expect you to fade. To shrink your life down into something manageable and undemanding, something that doesn't inconvenience anyone. To be grateful for what you're given, ask for little, occupy only the space allotted to you. And many of us do it. I did it, for a long time. I mistook self-erasure for grace. I thought patience was the same thing as strength. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken, and I told myself that was love. But that wasn't love. That was training myself to be invisible. Malcolm knew that about me. He spent 34 years gently pushing back against it, reminding me that he needed me present, not just available, that my opinions mattered, that my comfort mattered, that the home we built was mine as much as his and should feel that way. After he died, I forgot how to hold on to that. And then my daughter, under the weight of her own fear and financial desperation, slowly started to use that forgetting against me. I don't think she planned it. I don't think she woke up one morning deciding to erase her mother. I think it happened in increments. Each compromise building on the last, each silence mistaken for agreement, until the accumulation became a weight neither of us could fully see, until it crushed something between us. Audrey called on a Sunday in August with a different quality in her voice. Not performing calm, actually calm. She said she'd been in therapy for 2 months. She said she'd been thinking about the dinner party, about the curtains, about Patrick's phone call to the mortgage brokerage. She said she'd been trying to find the exact moment when she'd stopped seeing me clearly, and had been unable to find a single moment because it hadn't been one. "It happened the same way you said it did," she told me. "Gradually." And I just kept going. "I know," I said. "I think I was so scared after Dad died," she said. "Scared of being financially lost, scared of getting older, scared of," she stopped. "Then, I think I was angry that you got to keep living in the house, that you got to keep having the home and I had to leave it." I sat very still on my balcony. The bay was silver that evening, the light going out slowly. "You could have told me that," I said. "I know." Her voice broke slightly. "I think I didn't know how. So instead, I started claiming it," I said. A long silence. "Yes," she said. We stayed on the phone for a while without speaking. Sometimes that's what honesty costs. A silence long enough to actually hold the weight of what's been said. Eventually, Audrey asked if she could come visit. I said yes. She arrived on a Saturday with coffee and nothing performative about her. No bringing of elaborate dinners to demonstrate normalcy. Just herself, tired and sorry and present. We sat on my balcony and looked at the water, and I let her cry, and I cried a little too. Not for the house, for the years we'd lost to something that didn't have to happen. Before she left, she stood looking at the maple cutting on the balcony. "Is that?" "From the garden," I said. She reached out and touched one of the small leaves very gently. "Do you think it'll take?" "I don't know," I said, "but it's worth seeing." She nodded, pressed her lips together. Then she hugged me, actually hugged me, the way she used to when she was small, with her whole self in it. After she left, I watered the cutting and checked the soil. The leaves had held their color. Some new growth was starting at one of the stems, small and tentative and green. I went inside and poured a glass of wine and sat looking at the bay as the sun finished going down. 67 years old, living alone on the 7th floor of a building near the water. No grand house, no sprawling garden, no staircase with a squeaky third step. No husband reading in his chair by the window, and still, somehow, more myself than I had been in years. A home is not the walls. Malcolm was right about that. A home is the place where you are allowed to simply exist, without condition. Where your presence doesn't require justification. Where the people around you remember, daily, that you are still here. I found that again. And if I'm honest, I found it the moment I stopped waiting for someone else to give it back to me, and chose to take it for myself.